Welcome to Becoming Untriggered, a podcast brought to you by psychodynamic coaches and parents of three, Lavinia Brown and Andrew Lynn.
Together we normalise and unpack common challenges faced by couples and parents, explore how these could be symptoms of unprocessed trauma, and support you with the tried and tested tools for you to show up as the mum or dad, partner, and person you deserve to be. Welcome to Becoming Untriggered podcast. Today we have a very special guest. I'm super excited to talk to Jane Hardwicke Collings. So she was midwife, theatre and intensive care nurse, a mother, grandmother, writer, teacher, life partner. That is, as she describes it, working for the goddess. So the way that I came across you is in the work that you do to support women to reclaim and heal our rites of passage, namely menstruation when we come into womanhood, birth, motherhood, which is obviously what I focus on as a psychodynamic coach, and menopause. So most of our listeners are female, and most of them, if not all, are mothers and partners. So I think in terms of the mother bit, we're looking at how to be that guide for our daughters to help them to reclaim and heal their rites of passage, but also helping our sons respect that so that they grow into men that honor also those for what they are. And then some of the listeners, definitely me, going through perimenopause. So that's another angle that I'd love to get your wisdom on.
Awesome. Women and men in partnership as parents are really waking up to this need to pay attention to rites of passage, because if they're not honored, if they're not celebrated, if they're not acknowledged, whatever happens still is the rite of passage. And it has all the effects that rites of passage do, which we'll get into during our conversation. But it's really important to be aware of what's happening so that you can be instrumental and proactive in making it an empowering and positive experience for our children who are not children anymore at their puberty rite. So we're going to talk about girls and menstruation, but it's equally important for boys to be welcomed into manhood at their puberty. And that's not women's business, that's men's business. It's very important men's business, and they may not realize it because they didn't have it, but we may need to help them to remember that they need to do this.
I couldn't agree more. And I think ours is more obvious maybe in terms of motherhood and the changes that we go through and then perimenopause than it is for men. I think the more we can own our rites of passage and role model how to honor those, then hopefully they can follow suit. I thought I was doing the right thing in making quite a fuss of my two daughters when they both got their period. Was it even what I thought I would have liked to have had? I don't know. It was what I'd been through as an adult, doing a kind of ceremonial replaying of the ideal rite of passage. But when I tried to kind of recreate that on a mini scale for my daughters, and they were both quite young, they just turned 10. One was not yet 10. She was 9. And I think it was too much. It was too spiritual. It was too ceremonial. I got a red thread and bought them a little gift that was red, and they actually told me afterwards that it was not their thing. So I felt a bit like I really tried to make it special and I got it wrong. So how can we honor a rite of passage in the way that our children need, not the way that we feel they need?
I think we can be the ones who decide. That's the job of the parent. If we get drawn into this, let's just do what the children want all the time, then in this current world, with all the current stimulation and distraction, it might not be what we would want to be doing. I don't think you can get it wrong, Lavinia. I think you did an awesome job in what you're doing. And the other part we need to remember with all of this is when we introduce these kinds of things to our children, if they've never had an experience like that before, it might be a bit weird. So perhaps in preparation, others can think about how to ceremonialize other things in life so that when you get to menarche or puberty, it makes sense. Back in the day, there would have been many ceremonies, many rites of passage, many things going on in the community. But if it's an isolated incident that doesn't make sense, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means it's a new thing. Look, the thing is that when they get to however old they get to when they start looking at their rites of passage so far, and they sit in a women's circle and everybody's sharing what happened to you at your menarche, their stories may be embarrassing, may be too much, but they will be the healed version, not the here's the pads, welcome to the curse, don't show any weakness. So I think the main thing to be aware of with all of this work that we're doing, women's wisdom reclamation work, is that our daughters, they're growing up in a culture that is pretty weird. So disconnected from the body, so disconnected from the earth. So when we do something like what you've just done with your girls, it so stands out. But that's good. That's what rites of passage ceremonies are supposed to do. Think about the culturally accepted rite of passage of a marriage, a wedding. There's nothing more outrageous and flamboyant as that when it's done to the full max. The flamboyance, the celebration, the honouring and all of that is accepted. They're dealing with a culture at school or in their friendship group. So unless you're in a like-minded community, it'll be such a weird thing for them to share or hide from their friends. But in 10 years, when everybody's healing their menarche, they'll have a good story.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's reassured me. And you're right. I always say this to my clients, the psyche needs ceremony or ritual to prepare for something that is out of the ordinary. That's how it recognizes that this is something significant. This is meaningful. So you're quite right. In a way, the more weirded out they were, the better.
We have to remember that our children are part of the culture, not just our little family. And the culture is a negative menstrual cycle culture.
Yeah. I learned about tracking your menstrual cycle 10 years ago now. And when I did, it was such an eye-opener that I try and bring that in as another tool. I focus on healing your inner child, but I also try and bring in the other tool that you should be aware of, which gives context to your behavior. And that is your menstrual cycle and where you are in it and what's your body trying to tell you, what you need more of, what you need less of. So I tried to get them to be aware of that, but they're not interested now. But I think it is something that if I just keep role modeling and I keep reminding them of, it will go in when they're ready.
They've already been introduced to the menstrual cycle by watching you, especially when they're little. So I just want to say this little bit of a clue to women who've got small children. You don't go to the toilet on your own, right? So if you're trying to change a pad or a menstrual cup or whatever you use to collect your blood, you have to be doing some pretty clever gymnastics to be hiding what you're doing. So don't hide it. Bleed, have your period and your cycle in full view with the children. It's not going to freak them out. You know, they're fascinated with all things wee, poo and bodies, you know. So mothers get to normalize the menstrual cycle when they're little. It's in that 0 to 7 that everything's getting really formed. So especially with boys, if we can just normalize the menstrual cycle when they're following us to the toilet, because they won't do that forever. You know, there comes a time when the boys and girls do not follow you to the toilet, just in case you were wondering. And more than normalize, what I mean is to say, Mummy's bleeding today. Yay! That means we can have a rest today. Or that means we'll have some extra stories. Or that means we're going to go walk in the park. Or whatever it is, to normalize bleeding as a time to honor and rest within. That's the background. When they grow up and they go to school and do all the things they do and they start to meet the ick factor of menstrual cycles or menstrual blood, and then they have these ridiculous science lessons in school that just talk about the anatomy and physiology and freak them out about pregnancy when they're way too young to even know the connection between that. So it's really important that we balance what the children are receiving in terms of information and experience at home, because what's out there in the big wide world is not what you want them to be believing, because it's very misogynistic and patriarchal. There's a wonderful quote that I'll share from an Australian Queensland women's health practitioner, Sharon Maloney. She's done a PhD on the effects of menstrual shame on the experience of giving birth, which is very interesting. But what she says about the menstrual cycle is that rather than being initiated into womanhood at menarche, we are actually collectively initiated into menstrual shame. She says that menstrual shame is one of the organizing principles of the patriarchy to maintain the oppression of women.
You made me laugh because I remember when I used to drag, they won't do it now that they're teenagers, they're like, no, we're not coming. But every weekend, at least once, I drag everyone on a walk, at least an hour and a half. We take a picnic, and they didn't particularly love it, but it was our family thing. Because you know what it's like. Sometimes it's hard to really connect with children. And I found often that when you're walking, so you're not necessarily looking at each other, you're not necessarily asking each other's questions, but you're together and conversation comes much more easily. Anyway, I drag them on these walks every weekend, apart from when I had my period. So when I got my period, I was like, yes, we don't have to go for a walk.
Well, there you go. They got the message. And what we need to remember and what we need to teach the girls is that our menstrual cycle is actually a really important part of our lives. It's like our compass, and like Alexandra Pope from Red School says, the barometer of our well-being. And as the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, a version of God in our culture, have proclaimed, and they only did this recently, a decade or two ago, that the menstrual cycle is a woman's fifth vital sign. So pulse, blood pressure, temperature, respiration, and menstrual cycle. And it teaches us about the cycles, because that's what's running our life, whether we're paying attention or not just the menstrual cycle, but all the cycles. And that is really countercultural in a patriarchy, because the patriarchy doesn't do cycles. It's just on and up and forever growing and growing and growing. Now, the point here to remember is that there is nothing in nature that's healthy that keeps growing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we as women have such a fundamental role to play in changing that, because when we role model to the family that we're resting, the men in the family have to rest too, because their signs to rest aren't so obvious. In a way, I think of it as a gift. Wow, there's something in my life that makes me take time out. So you're giving them that outlet to give themselves permission to rest because you are.
For everybody who doesn't have a menstrual cycle, and this includes us post-menopause, we don't lose a cycle, we don't have a cycle. So everybody on the planet who doesn't have a menstrual cycle, for whatever reason, could be pregnant, could be postmenopausal, could be breastfeeding and your period hasn't come back yet, or really athletic women, their period often stops because they haven't got enough fat on them to have a period, or eating disorders sometimes stop menstrual cycle for the same reason. The point being that it's a cycle that we need to honor, and that men and everybody else, we're influenced by the lunar cycle. So the rest phase in the lunar cycle, which is the blueprint for the menstrual cycle, is the dark moon and the new moon. That's another phase of the cycles that is rest time, as well as winter. I love this new verb that we're using now for the rest that needs to happen at winter, of wintering, which is like the earth season when that's equivalent to bleeding.
Yes. I love how you bring in this rites of passage theme into life. Like you said, there are many cycles going on at the same time. So let's move into birth. I think that was really helpful in terms of how we can role model being the mothers to our children that we didn't necessarily have, which is all about my work, how to inner parent when your parents weren't able to meet your needs in the way you needed them. So this podcast is very much about becoming untriggered, learning how to recognize when you're triggered and work with your triggers so that you're no longer carrying that stuff that is being stirred up by the people. Motherhood is a massive source of triggers because many of my clients, me included, didn't fully recognize what we'd missed out on until we tried to be what we hadn't received. And that's when this stuff all comes up about your childhood, because you're having to be this mother that was never role model to your child. And it's really difficult. And I don't think it's supported in the way that you and I have been talking about at all. Maybe a little bit more now. The worst gets worse as we get older. Like none of these rites of passage are. Menopause isn't at all. But maybe we could touch on birth, because I really remember something that I read that you'd wrote, that each birth teaches you something about not only yourself, but also that child.
I guess the way to really explain this is to explain how rites of passage work. Now, rites of passage, as I already said, happen whether you're paying attention or not. So there's physical rites of passage, which is what we're going to focus on. But there's also cultural rites of passage, like weddings, graduation, things like that. And the physical ones are cultural as well, because they reflect the culture's values, how they happen and don't happen. And so whatever happens at a rite of passage, whatever doesn't happen, who's there, what they say, who's not there, what doesn't get said, and whatever's going on in your world at that time. This is going on for menarche, first period. Every pregnancy results in a birth. Whatever finishes a pregnancy is a birth, including losses and abortions. And then menopause. So menarche is when the blood flows for the first time. Pregnancy and birth, that's from conception to postnatal, is the rite of passage. And then menopause, the rite of passage is from the beginning to when the hormones get to their new old normal, all adds up to teach the person going through the rite of passage in a subliminal way, which means we don't even realize we're being taught. We're taught how our culture values the next role we're going into. So at menarche, that's woman. At pregnancy and birth, that's motherhood. At menopause, that's our wise woman, second half of our life. It teaches us how our culture values that next role and therefore how we have to behave to be accepted by our culture in that role. She who was initiated into womanhood at menarche is the woman who shows up to give birth completely enculturated into how she's supposed to behave to be accepted as a woman. Now, we can see from the birth stats the effect of that. So right now, here in Australia, where I'm from, and it won't be very different in any of the other modern Western maternity systems, less than 50% of women are pushing their babies out of their vaginas. That's ridiculous and terrible and a sign of unnecessary intervention. And intervention causes birth trauma. Not for everybody, but 1 in 3 women have birth trauma. And 1 in 10 of those 1 in 3 have PTSD from their birth experience, which is a brain injury. And then at menopause, like right now, menopause has been turned into a disease that you need to be medicated against, or else all these terrible things are going to happen. So back to birth. The stats reveal what the implied message is, that your body doesn't work, it doesn't come into labor on time, you grow a baby that's too big to fit out of you or too small, or all the things that we've already been told about ourselves, too big, too small, too loud, too quiet, blah, blah, blah. All of that adds up to teach you how to behave. The thing is that whenever we come to a rite of passage, we come to a fork in the road. And one way is the usual way, the same old way, the way it always happens to me or in my family or in my culture. And that is the wounded way, but we don't even realize it. It's just the way it always happens. The other fork in the road that everybody has the opportunity to take at their next rite of passage is the healed way. But in order to see a healed way, you have to realize you're on the wounded way. Then you need to do the inner work that bridges the two, that sets you off in the healed direction, which doesn't mean all of a sudden everything's going to go your way. It means you start to recognize the decisions or the choices or the fears that you had or the attitudes and beliefs that you were holding that you may not have even believed. Every rite of passage that we're coming to, we have this opportunity. And one rite of passage is a setup for the next one. The other part happens, and I've learned this from my own personal experiences and as a midwife for 30 years, that we have the birth we need to have to teach us what we need to learn about ourselves to take us to the next place on our journey. And that may not be what you wanted. It may not be what your birth plan said. It may not be anything that you had in mind, but it'll be what you need to teach you what you need to learn. Like in the way that you're talking already about how in motherhood we are often triggered by all the things that didn't happen or did happen and how we want to be the kind of mother or parent we want to be now. So the way we give birth also choreographs how we mother. And the lesson we learn from giving birth to the baby, and this can be other than human babies too, because in our summer or creatrix season of our lives, we conceive, gestate, birth, and need to look after all manner of things besides humans, podcasts or businesses or careers or whatever. So whatever we learn about ourselves in birthing the baby, human or otherwise, is the quality we need to bring to mothering or nurturing or looking after that. The process here is to recall the birth story, including an abortion or a loss. So for somebody wanting to do this process for themselves and they're thinking, well, what's she talking about? How can it be a teacher? And I didn't want that. I didn't need that, blah, blah, blah. When we can unravel the teaching, it unravels what we've brought to the situation. So our life so far, it's a great thing. We can learn from a birth something that we didn't do or didn't have. As a home birth midwife at 27, planning to have a home birth, and I labored for hours and pushed for hours and I couldn't budge the baby's head. I later realized the head I couldn't budge was my own. And I was a hospital transfer and ended up having an in-labor cesarean. And that was a shock and a disappointment. But when I debriefed and unraveled my experience, I realized that that felt very familiar to me. So I could see that the teaching of that first birth was about surrender, because I didn't surrender. I didn't know I didn't surrender, and I didn't know that I didn't know how to surrender. So in learning that birth taught me about surrender completely unraveled my life in terms of why I couldn't, didn't surrender. And that takes me way back to my inner child, wounded child healing that needed to happen when I was next facing this idea of needing surrender. So another big teaching that women often have is about support. If they don't have enough support or the right support, their birth teaches them that. Or it can be something that you had to draw on from deep within yourself to navigate the experience. And common things are trust my intuition, listen to my inner knowing, use my voice, things like that. For example, I'm 67 and a half and my firstborn is now 40 and I need to continue and have needed to continue to bring the concept of surrender in my mothering of him, even as an adult, because if I step back into what I was thinking I was doing without even realizing it, which was trying to midwife myself and think, okay, I will be fully dilated in X amount of hours. Talk about naive and inexperienced. So I need to bring surrender to my relationship with my firstborn. Otherwise, we just end up back at that head against the cervix for hours, which is not a very nice experience at 67 and 40. The thing is that birth is a sexual experience. So you're bringing all of your journey through your sexuality to giving birth as well. And so if I'd known what I know now, I would have remembered or known that birth is a sexual experience. And so I could have had some clues because as a 20 and 25-year-old, I had difficulty orgasming. But putting things together, the surrender you need to do to have an orgasm is the same surrender you need to do to have a baby. So that's a big clue for everybody. Practicing orgasms is a good practice for surrender at birth. One leads to the next. If I hadn't taken that surrender to my next birth, I would have probably had another cesarean because the doctor was encouraging me to do that. But I knew as a midwife how to see through that fear-oriented perspective. He said, oh, Jane, your ischial spines, which is part of the bony outlet of the pelvis, are just too close together. So you'll never have a vaginal birth. You might as well just have cesarean. So everything will be all right, but just do that. And that happens in so many ways for so many different women in so many other birth experiences, like your body's this, your body's that, blah, blah, blah. But I already knew as a midwife, all I have to do is squat and it opens up my pelvis by 3 centimeters. So point being that I took surrender to my next birth and I had a vaginal birth after cesarean for that because I knew what the surrender was and how I had to let go.
Absolutely. I'm still not fully there with my second or third. I think you've dropped a clue for me about my first. It was always about surrender for me, 100%. That's been my whole life, surrendering, not trying to be in control. But what the word that you said, which is something I bring up a lot in my work, is you said it was familiar. And I suddenly went, oh my God, I didn't surrender because I've always relied on other people knowing better than me. I think there is lots of different angles of surrender, aren't there? And if you're enough, you couldn't possibly cope with this on your own. And I brought that into my parenting, reading all the guidebooks, following it line by line, not trusting my instinct.
Our birth experiences are not random. They are the expression of our mindset, our beliefs, attitudes, and fears, what our body is doing or not doing and holding, and also the culmination of our life so far. If we map our rites of passage, there's a theme. So my theme is surrender. And then that came up again at menopause.
I got the surrendering bit, but I didn't feel strong enough and there wasn't enough self-love to then take it on from there. So you can't really surrender.
It's not a power over scenario or somebody who knows better. You're surrendering to the process.
But also you need to feel safe, right? That goes back to the inner chart. I never felt safe in my body. So I was trying to surrender, but surrender to what? If you don't feel safe, you're not going to be embodied.
What we've missed out on realizing is we have to know ourselves. Self-awareness is not just what you're thinking, it's why you're thinking that and where it's come from. This concept of self-awareness, which is really the basis of all the stuff that I do, all the work that I offer, is not a new concept. Know thyself was written across the mantle of the doorway at the temple of the Oracle of Delphi. That became the temple of Apollo, and the first Viking rune, Manaz, is know thyself. So this is an ancient concept that is so necessary. Because if we don't know ourselves, then what are we doing? Making mistakes everywhere. Becoming untriggered. To do that, you have to recognize what your triggers are. And that's what we're talking about. Your trigger and mine it's not safe to surrender. So nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to really work to its full potential unless people like you and me feel safe.
My second was a VBAC, but it ended up with forceps. It was just as awful because I knew I should be surrendering. But to me, that felt like, I need to be more natural. It needs to be in a birth pool. I need to have music and everything. No, that wasn't it. But you can't force feeling safe, can you? So in a way, as with our children, every rite of passage teaches us, like you said, what we need to learn next. The rite of passage, whatever it is the rite of passage. You're being shown what you need to do next. So you can't necessarily get it right.
But we will have the experience we need to have. This is a grand vision. This is big picture thinking. This is looking at our life in total rather than an isolated event, which is actually the problem with women's health. We're seeing it now with menopause and obviously with childbirth. They're not isolated incidents. They are our life story, and not just our life story, but our red thread, our mother line, our female generational story playing out. That's where they play out in our rites of passage.
And yet we live in this society right now where there's no concept really of a rite of passage, and yet we've got this perfect birth up there on a pedestal. So we're both being told that we didn't do it right and there is no holding to get it right. And like you said, you're not even meant to get it right. I think there's so much comparison and shaming around, you got an epidural. Oh, right. Oh, you did that, did you? Mm-hmm. Oh, I had an orgasm when I gave birth. I had a pain-free. Great. And I know you've done a post about this. You said, let's celebrate positive birth, which is amazing. And I'm delighted for people that've had that. I'm like, wow. But there are also people that you weaponize that. So we're living in a really screwed up paradigm.
Yeah, there's a lot of clues in that. The first thing is the grandest cloud over that, shall we say, or influence, is that all our portals to power, feminine wisdom, knowledge, inner strength and awareness and interconnectedness to other women and the earth and everything, all our portals of power, the menstrual cycle, childbirth and menopause have all been pathologized, medicalized, weaponized against us and monetized. None of our rites of passage are seen in the mainstream as something to honor and celebrate. They're looked at for their risks and their danger. It's classic. And if we can remember where medicine came from, and I've written about this in my little book called Herstory, which is how the patriarchy has affected women and the feminine. Medicine started in the Middle Ages under the control of the church, and the male body was seen as the normal and the female as the abnormal. So that's the roots of where we come from. And the other thing that you're talking about, the comparison and the criticism and whatnot, we are taught and encouraged to compare ourselves with each other, criticize each other, compete with each other, and judge each other. That's what we are encouraged to do in the patriarchy. And that results in the wounded feminine and the wounded sisterhood. And it's just an age-old tactic called divide and conquer. And whilst women are divided, competing, comparing, criticizing, judging, we are so easy to control. But if we, and I think this is one of the most important jobs of our lifetime, is to heal the sisterhood. So if we can come together and not judge each other, not compare, criticize, compete, then we can co-create the healed sisterhood, and then we will not be able to be controlled. We will be a force to be reckoned with. And that's what has to happen. Judgment actually starts within. So if you don't judge yourself, you're highly unlikely to judge anybody else. But everybody judges themselves. That's what we've been taught to do in a patriarchy. You're too this, you're not enough of this, blah, blah, blah. So in my live workshops, I propose a dare. And my dare is for the women at the workshop is that they don't judge themselves all day. And then I say, because I think it's probably highly unlikely that you're going to be able to do that, write down all the times you judged yourself during the day and catch the subject that you judged yourself over and see if you can identify the person who's speaking in your mind, telling you whatever. And then at the end of the day, you get a list of how you have internalized the patriarchy and therefore your list of the inner work you need to do to dismantle, decolonize your mind from the patriarchy. So there is a lot of value in understanding why we judge each other around birth and what that reveals and what we can do about that individually and collectively to do a big overhaul where women are on the same side as each other.
Yeah, I love that. It's because it's not sacred to us and we feel that pain, that loss of that sacredness. We then, because we don't know ourselves, like I said, know thyself, we project it onto other people as judgment.
How a culture values the earth is how they value women. So you don't have to look too hard to see what's going on with all the different cultures and how they treat the earth, because it's the same as how women are treated. Controlled, sanitized, metaphorically. So there's a lot more going on than just us bickering with each other, especially when we remember our red thread. And for women with European descent, it's not that many generations ago. So in the witch hunt. And then the only way between the two of us that one of us survives is if we tell on the other.
Yeah.
And even make up bullshit to save our lives. So that is part of our heritage.
The ones that survived are the ones that told on each other. That's painful.
Or hid somehow, or lied.
It can make you furious and desperate at the same time, but we're reinventing ourselves all the time, aren't we?
Yeah, it's in our rites of passage where we reinvent ourselves. So that's the thing. These rites of passage are all they are, but they are also, and this is the good bit, they are also how we can hack the culture. By changing the way we do rites of passage, we change the culture and we change the future.
Yeah. On that, creating the future, what I'm finding coming up for my daughters who are 14 and 16 is that despite my generation having lived through the effects of patriarchy and having been sexualized and denigrated and second fiddle to men as we are in a patriarchy, we all vowed to be different and we've all had sons, or some of us had sons, and we've been open with them and wanted them to be kind and role modeled a different way of being than our parents did. And yet I hear from my daughters that teenage boys are being exactly the same as they were to the people that are now their parents. And I don't understand why. How do you think that's happening and how can we change that? Is it that the culture is more important than what's being role modeled at home?
Totally. Just think about the influences on the boys. Porn. The largest market of porn is teenage boys and teenage girls. That's their sex ed. And it's based on wanting people to buy more. It's based on an addiction situation and dopamine. And so it has to be more something to keep the customers. And sadly, the customers are teenage boys and teenage girls. The other thing is gaming. There is violence, there is rape, and there is misogyny in the games, especially the most popular games. It's the whole dopamine thing that keeps us doing things. So how to help boys with that? That's for men to do. You know, you're doing what you're doing, but in terms of role models, a woman cannot be a role model for their son. So men need to step up here. And this links back to their rite of passage into puberty, into manhood. Something has to happen there where they learn about respect for themselves first. In a patriarchy, the only cultures that have survived are the cultures that have sacrificed their men, not just their women. So the cultures today, alive and well in the patriarchy, sacrifice their men to war and also sacrifice our men to having to work for the man, you know, the business, the government, whatever. So at puberty, boys need to learn that they, just like girls, need to step into sovereignty and agency and whatnot. But the culture's not supporting that. So men have to step in the same way that we're stepping into. Men need to do that too at their boys' rites of passage. And if there's not a man in your family, you've got to find somebody. So this also highlights the ridiculousness of our nuclear family and how lost we are without our village. I always say this to mothers, you need to find the village where you can celebrate your children's puberty rites of passage within, because they're cultural community events. They don't happen in isolation in your bedroom. They happen in public, in your village. So you are acknowledged, celebrated, and honored. So that, I think, is going to be a big pathway to changing the disrespect that we see boys against girls or men against women. And it's changing, but it's not changing fast enough. And then in terms of the girls, they have to learn about consent and about their bodies and have proper menstrual and sex education, not just anatomy and physiology and this is what a sperm looks, this is what a tampon looks like. Learn about all the processes so that they can understand and respect and love their bodies and work with them. If we get that right when they're younger, maybe it won't happen in childbirth, because there's even a term called obstetric rape. When they're having an internal examination, they're saying, stop, get out, and they don't. That's called obstetric rape. This is happening a lot, sadly. And if we could get this consent thing right back at puberty, then it may not change everybody wherever they are now, but hopefully those kids growing up who've been taught about consent and about autonomy and sovereignty and how to respect their bodies and therefore how to get other people to respect their choices and their bodies, then birth will change. If we initiate our daughters into menarche in an empowering way, everything will change.
Wow. So much to digest. Yes. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I think part of the problem is we don't have wise women like you. Honestly, yes, we can get a village, but if we're all lost, then it's not much of a village without a matriarch, without a patriarch, but in a good sense. We need our elders.
Totally.
So thank you so much for being our online elder today and sharing. I'm sure a lot of what you've said will be completely new to the listeners, which is amazing because it's just so much to start thinking about and start processing to get to know thyself, right?
Yes, exactly. I would suggest also in the research to know thyself, find out everything you can about your mother's life and your grandmother's life. Now, you may know this, but I'm sure some of the listeners won't, that when you're pregnant with a daughter, from halfway through the pregnancy, all that baby girl's eggs form in her ovary. So from halfway on, you have all the grandchildren you would ever have from her in your womb. So the implication of that is that you, me, all of us were in our grandmother's wombs, in our mother's ovary, and we experienced as that most prima materia of ourselves, the second half of the pregnancy our grandmother had of our mother and the birth she did. And then we were in our mother's bodies all the way up until we were the egg that ripened, ovulated, was conceived, and then we gestated in our mother's womb until we were born and we left her body and then we were fed, completely absorbing everything she's thinking, doing, and processing, not just in the breastfeeding, but for her whole life. So if we can all understand our grandmother and our mother's lives, a lot of what we do, especially unconsciously and especially wounded behaviors, will make sense. And it's not a curse. All it takes is one woman in the family line to say, whoa, this stops with me. I'm going to do the inner work required to stop unconsciously passing on trauma responses, mental health stuff, violence, abuse. So that's another big part of Know Thyself. If you want to understand why you are where you are, look where you've come from.
Yes. Well, my listeners know all about looking back and understanding where they've come from. So thank you for threading that all back to where we intersect. So again, thank you so much. So useful. Please, will you send me the link to your book and anything else that you'd like the listeners to read or to find out more about you? I'm going to put Jane's website and Instagram on there because she's amazing and there's so much wisdom coming out.
I've also created the world's only holistic menstrual cycle charting app. It's called Spinning Wheels, and it's also has a special part to it for menopausal women, but basically it's part of the Know Thyself and the cycle so that it connects you to your menstrual cycle, the lunar cycle, the earth season cycle, and your life cycle. So it helps you understand yourself on a daily basis.
If what we discussed was helpful, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. For more of the same, check out my social media, The Inner Child Healing Expert, or to work with me, go to laviniabrown.com.
You can find me on andrewlynn.net or Life Coach for Dads on Instagram. We work with both individuals and couples. If there are any topics you'd like us to cover, please reach out. Thanks for listening.